Today I'm speaking with Ashhar Farhan, and we will be discussing the social and economic status of Muslims in India. First, I'd like to say thank you so much for speaking with me today, and if you could give a little bit about yourself and some background.
Well, I'm an entrepreneur. I shouldn't call serial because there is a long series, just a couple of 3 or 4 exits. And I come from a family of people who have been academicians and in literature. So I'm a first generation entrepreneur. Before this, nobody was that. And I'm a Hyderabadi.
Okay, how many generations of your family have lived in Hyderabad, and where did your family originally come from?
Well, I'm second generation living in Hyderabad.
Okay.
My father came from Aurangabad and my mom came from a town in UP called Badaयूं.
And who brought them there?
Well,
Here.
my grandparents brought themselves. So my father came here to complete his studies, and he stayed back in Hyderabad for higher studies. And my mother's family moved from UP to here because my grandfather was part of, as he wrote, youthful foolishness of revolution. So he made some speeches against the British, so he had to move to Hyderabad.
Okay. And did the partition of India affect your family in any way? And did you have any family that left for Pakistan? Why did they leave? And do you think they would have been better off if they stayed in India?
All my father's family moved to Pakistan except him. And he did not move for ideological reasons. He didn't believe that a state can be formed on basis of a religion. So he stayed back. And we did keep going back and forth between India and Pakistan. I mean, after Hyderabad, if there's any city I've spent most amount of time, it's actually Karachi.
Okay.
So all of my father's siblings, his brothers that is, and mom, everybody moved to Pakistan and we stayed in Pakistan. And I still have a substantially large, all my father's side is there. My mother's side not much, but my aunt migrated to Pakistan.
Okay. So I kind of want to ask you about anti-Muslim sentiment in India. Do you think during your lifetime you've seen the relationship between the Muslim minority and other Indians change at all in Hyderabad or in India more broadly?
So I think I'm not competent to answer that because I'm not a sociologist. It's best asked to somebody who's in the field, because the only thing I know about this stuff is that your anecdotal experience. If I say no, I've got friends, my closest friends are Hindus, right? It's a trope. Or you say my closest of my friends are Muslims, and then you go on to say something horrible about them. So all anecdotal evidence is false, right? Because you do not represent any particular large category of these people at all. And to say that Muslims are being persecuted is not right. And if you look at cricket, they're not being persecuted. If you look at movies, they're not being persecuted. But if you look at business, then there's a complete wipeout. Okay. If you look at politics, there's a complete wipeout. So it's a very sector-specific thing, and I wouldn't stick my neck out and say it either way, because nor am I committed. That's not my area of study, right? So I'll refrain from answering it. But all I'll say is that in certain areas there is a bias. You can see it in numbers, not anything else.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know why that is, but for example, in UP, if you see that in Uttar Pradesh, 25% of the population is Muslims, but hardly 2% of the representatives in the assembly and parliament are Muslims. So the percentages don't add up.
Yeah.
And so the way it works is like this, that in areas where Muslims do not have equal representation, whether they are in business, they are in economy, wherever. See, for example, I mean, I follow politics closely, so this is my theory again.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. What happens is that, for example, if there's a Muslim-dominated area, right, and there is a non-Muslim representative there who says that I'm secular and I'll protect you guys, right? Or his party says that, or her party says that, and then they get the votes. After that, this person leaves that party and goes and joins a conservative right-wing Hindu
Yeah.
party.
Uh-huh.
So suddenly these Muslim votes which have voted this person have now gone off to somebody else, right? So what happens is that Muslims vote for people who they believe will stand up for them, but they do not stand up for them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you'll never see any area where a Muslim has stood and won elections in a non-Muslim majority area.
Yeah.
So the Muslim votes get translated to non-Muslims votes, and Muslims will vote for non-Muslims, but non-Muslims will never vote for Muslims. That's been the history of elections. So if you play around with those figures, then you realize why this is happening.
Okay. And some argue that anti-Muslim rhetoric is just election-related propaganda. And that it does not represent most Indians. Do you believe this to be true? Or?
Very difficult to say again, but it's not about Muslims, right? Actually, the elephant in the room which you need to address is the caste. So what happens is, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, each time there is elections and a new government comes in, they promote everybody of their own caste, not religion. Okay. So, for example, when Chandrababu Naidu was here, all the Kamas got, very plump posts. They got free lands to set up their businesses. I mean, for example, there's a government policy, right, which says we give you free land if you, for example, bring some exports. But the government has the option of selecting people, right,
Yeah.
that they will give it to and say, no, your paperwork is not complete, your project is not feasible. So they will always side with their own caste.
Yeah.
So it's happened for 3-4 successive governments, and now the Congress government has come. So actually, less than Congress, it's the Reddy government which has come. So the Reddy caste will now push their own agenda.
Do you think anti-Muslim sentiment affected you or your family in any way? And as a Muslim, do you really feel at home in India?
I can't say because you tend to make choices. For example, I have always picked up businesses in which there was no need to interact with the government until very recently. Okay. That I never worked for anything which required even a license from the government. So you just do, for example, software exports, or you do your businesses outside.
Yeah.
And I think those choices are implicit in where you come from. That you say, you'll do this. But yeah, for example, access to venture capital. So you need to wine and dine with them. Wine being the underlying word. It's very difficult for you to, break into that in quotes club of people who, and it's a social network, right? I mean, businesses are social networks, and they are based on caste lines more than anything else. So, I mean, for example, I find it much easier to work with foreign collaborators than with Indian collaborators for similar reasons.
Okay. And do you think that that's caused you to be able to practice your religion freely? And do you feel like you've...
I'm not a very religious person. I mean, I'm a person of science, right?
Uh-huh.
But culturally, I assert that I'm a Muslim from a Muslim heritage, right? I speak Urdu. I work for Urdu to preserve Urdu culture and all that. And this cultural center is one of its key things is that it will promote Urdu culture. So if you look at the Muslim culture, that's very different from Muslim religion, right? And increasingly that is becoming very conservative in India because a lot of people are coming back from Middle East and settling here, and they are bringing the Middle Eastern sensibility of Muslims here. So that's actually becoming a problem.
So, since Urdu is primarily a Muslim Indian language, have you seen the decline of Urdu here in Hyderabad? And in other words, do you believe that the bias against Muslims is causing Muslims to lose their culture?
Okay, again, I'll refrain from saying that it's a bias against Muslims, but there's been a bias against Urdu.
Okay.
And this will take a little time for me to explain, but because I worked with Urdu, my first business was actually to create systems which allowed Urdu to come onto computers. I mean, for example, until I built my software, all Urdu newspapers and books were written by hand. So it's the first time you could calligraph it because laser printers had been invented and all that. So that was one of the bits. So I am involved with this, and I have a family background. My mom is one of the foremost Urdu living writers now, Jilani Bano. My father has done some extensive cataloging work for libraries, international libraries and all that. So given that background, what has happened, so I know a little bit of history of Urdu. Now Urdu was the official language of India until 47. Not official, but it was, I mean, semi-official language that everybody wrote in Urdu. All literature, including Hindu religious literature, was more available in Urdu than in any other language, right? Mahabharata, there were 18 translations. But what happened is, they created a language in the early 20th century called Hindi, which did not exist before. For example, you go to, I mean, it looks like I'm being extremely biased here, but there are no 19th century Hindi poets. There are none. There are no 19th century Hindi novelists. There are none, because the language was identified and created only the early 20th century to differentiate it from Urdu. And they started using the Devanagari script, and they started writing, taking in more and more Sanskritized words into it. So now it's become a different language. But the so-called Hindi movies that you see, they are all Urdu. Like from Mughal-e-Azam to the latest, that Dunki, they are all Urdu, right? They say Ishq, they say Mohabbat, they say, Dushman. They don't say Shatru, they don't say Prem. You see that, right? So they have co-opted Urdu and they have called it something else. So, and even today, Urdu is a language of the masses, right? That Hindi nobody speaks. What they speak is Urdu, and Urdu actually means the street. It's the language of the street, right? So Urdu is not, as it's made out to be, a language of the Nawabs and all that, but it is what people speak ordinarily. Okay, which is why the movie songs are written in Urdu, right? If you see the Urdu lyricists, I mean, if you look at Hindi movies, you see who are the top lyricists. It will be Gulzar, it will be Javed Akhtar, and these people are all Urdu people, right? So I'm just using movies as one thing. And even now, the largest website of Urdu literature is this thing called Rekhta, right? It is ironically created and sustained by a Gujarati Hindu, Sanjeev Saraf. Okay, and there is no other language probably in the world which has a resource like Rekhta, right? And the Rekhta festival, which is done every December, attracts about 200,000 people. I mean, it's about 5 times Woodstock, if you know what I'm talking about. So it's huge, which means that there is a lot of popular thing which the government fails to acknowledge.
So do you think that there are any aspects of Muslim culture that are becoming extinct, like more broadly in relation to food and clothing, other than Urdu?
Well, the Muslim culture is changing very rapidly. The old Muslim culture is being replaced by the new Muslim culture, right? For example, if you look at this girl at the counter, she's my daughter's very close friend. She's in complete burqa. Her mom doesn't wear burqa. Right? So it's also a question of Muslim feeling a little threatened or something, and they want to assert their identity. Almost all my cousins have beards now. Okay, I mean, I didn't have a beard. None of my father's generation ever grew a beard. My father actually was head of Islamic Studies department. Nobody in that department had a beard. Okay, and they're becoming extremely conservative. Okay, and it's coming from top down. I mean, the wealthier Muslims are propagating this thing. Okay, for example, let's say, I'm sorry to take an example which hits very close to your heart, but let's say the NRI Muslims who come here. Okay, in the US, they'll work with mixed gender in the sense that they'll go out, they'll speak to others. They are working at gas stations, they are working in colleges and universities. But in the shadi here, they will have a zanana and mardana, right? And they are far more hardcore about it. And I've seen this even in the US, that when you go to a Muslim guy's dinner, just for that day they'll have segregation, right? Which is not going to be there at all. And if you look at, for example, the entire LGBTQ thing, Hyderabad as a state had a state policy where they give scholarships to transgenders. What are called hijras, right? They actually had a place here near High Court where the Nizam gave a special place for them, where they could stay on their own, right? And they were given pensions. Actually, I shouldn't call it. They were given pension by the Nizam, etc., etc. From there to now, where this entire thing saying they're trying to convert Muslim guys into gays and this. I mean, I don't know what's going on, but there is certainly a huge move towards being ultra conservative among Hyderabadi Muslims.
Yeah.
I can see that, and that's coming from top down.
Yeah. So the city of Hyderabad has a rich history of Muslim culture and heritage. Do you think the city has been able to preserve the Muslim sites and historical?
Yeah, I mean, historical sites will get preserved. For example, Charminar will get preserved,
Yeah.
right? But the more important things which are being lost culturally.
Yeah.
And that's because Muslims themselves are withdrawing from that. They don't want to acknowledge certain pasts which, for example, now they think are shameful.
Yeah. Do you think they're being forced to think that it's shameful by like some other power? Like the
I mean,
Hindus?
See, what happened was basically these things are driven by who wields power within your society,
Yeah.
right? So earlier, the power belonged to the intellectuals, to the bureaucrats who were all Muslims. So they had a very secular, very progressive outlook. They were all, Western educated and all that. Now the money is with the businessmen class, with people, who themselves are not culturally tuned to the history, right?
Yeah.
So they're just pushing their own agenda,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, to be like the oppressor, so to say, right? So you basically
Yeah.
follow their footsteps. You
Yeah.
want to be like them, and they're extremely conservative because they can afford to be that. For example, women shouldn't go out and work. Okay, it's now a very standard trope everywhere that they should. I mean, if you're dressing up where only your like eye slits show, there are very few jobs that you can do, and it's all right if you are a very moneyed class that women can afford to sit at home. But what do you do with the rest of the population? So as a result, you take this population away. They can't work because they can't work, and you're putting all sorts of rules on them about movement, restricting women's movement, restricting what they can say, what they can do, where they can hang out. You're losing half of your human count who are not being economically productive at all.
So there's a part of Hyderabad known as the Old City, and most of the people who live there are Muslim.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Old City has changed over the years, and why do you think it's
Okay,
changed?
first, it's actually not true that it's a majority Muslim area.
Okay.
I mean, there are more Muslims there, but there is a substantial amount. For example, Charminar area, majority are not Muslims.
Okay.
Okay, you imagine that it is that way, but it is not. Old City is very it's odd, and it's very complicated,
Yeah.
and it's very layered. It's very difficult to say anything about it offhand. But for example, there are more girls from Old City that are working now than before. Okay. And in certain ways, the burqa helps them do that because it sort of levels their social status. On the other hand, given that some women are coming out, it is very, I mean, unemployment is very rife, and conservatism is on the rise, and education is actually of very low quality. That's the whole problem. So, Old City doesn't have a problem with unemployment, but with unemployability.
Yeah.
They can't ace an interview.
Okay. So I've heard that many Muslims in India face economic hardships. Do you feel that the loss of economic opportunities are happening because people are Muslim, and if so, like, why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, see, for example, first, what has happened is it's got into a negative loop. You are not educated yourself, so as a result, you do not, for example, first understand the value of education. Second, you don't know, you can't afford it, and most importantly, you don't have the wherewithal to, for example, get a scholarship.
Yeah.
For example, you say the Muslim scholarships. So the Muslim scholarships are given for 100,000 people. There's only 20,000 applied, so we are now this year slashing it down to 50,000. So they don't have access to that. Now, to get a scholarship, you need an Aadhaar card, you need a bank account, you need a white ration card, you need 15 different things. They don't have the documentation in place, and they try to get this documentation and they shoot away.
Yeah.
So there is a bias. I mean, for example, let's say there's a help counter, right? Somebody goes and approaches that counter. So if a Muslim in a beard and kurta pajama, topi comes there, this guy is speaking Urdu, and that clerk there is speaking Telugu,
Yeah.
right there the communication breaks down. Then they sort of, even if they are not biased, but there's a communication problem and they say, oh God, I mean, how do I handle this guy now? That
Yeah.
kind of a thing. So, and I don't know why, but Muslims are less and less integrating themselves in picking up the regional languages. For example, I can't speak Telugu.
Yeah.
I should be Telugu, and there's no reason for me to not speak Telugu.
So do you think that life has changed for Muslims in Hyderabad from the time you were younger, and are Muslims holding the same jobs today as they were before?
Well, it has certainly changed. It has certainly changed. The city itself has changed. I mean, our city was 5 lakh people then, 500,000 people, right? Now it's 5 million people.
Yeah.
So it's more probably, closer to 10 million people. And because the number of people who are less, the social network spanned the entire city. For example, I mean, if there were 500,000 people in the entire city, people of my age in my social class must have been about 10,000 of them, right?
Yeah.
And so if there are 10,000 of them, and out of those 10,000, if you see how many computer geeks are there, which I was at that time, it would be about 200 or 500. So you know all of them by,
Yeah.
by default. Or if you said, okay, I'm interested in music, so you know everybody in the city.
Yeah.
So everybody knew everybody is what you thought. Now it's become an alien city because of the way city itself has happened. That's nothing to do with being Muslims. But the fact is that relatively Muslims have not upped their game. For example, they never invested into businesses. They were coming from a feudal background, right?
Yeah.
So they didn't even know how to do business. And they thought that business was a very inferior thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, when I announced to my family that I'd like to get into business, my dad was aghast. He thought I'd do a PhD and become a respectable professor in the university, right? That was
Yeah.
his dream job. But I said, no, I'm going to do business. And my mom would keep saying, why does this guy need money? Right? And because it's
Yeah.
just not in their DNA.
Yeah.
I mean, my family is different because they valued education and scholarship and all that above trying to, in quotes, make money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Do you think the education level for Muslims versus non-Muslims, do you think that there's a difference, and do you think that the economic status of Muslims is related to their education level?
yeah, I mean, also education level. But education level is not all there is to it, right? And after that, there's a bias. For example, if you look at UP, okay, Uttar Pradesh, as I said, the 25% of the people there are Muslims.
Yeah.
As a result, a lot of them do qualify. They go to Bihar and all these places, get coached, and become IPS officers. But all of them have been sidelined.
Yeah.
They're given, very ordinary things like saying, you're an IPS officer, fine, but you are Director General of uniforms, right? Police uniforms,
Yeah.
not, law and order or something like that. So they are usually, I mean, the key posts rarely go to Muslims.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fact. There's no denying that.
Do you think there are any concrete steps that can be taken to address anti-Muslim sentiment in India?
Well, anti-Muslim sentiment has now become the identity of India,
Yeah.
right? I mean, in 20th century, all countries were formed on the basis of othering people,
Uh-huh.
okay? Which said that, I am Jewish, so this is Israel. Or you say, I am Palestini, so, I'm not Jewish.
Yeah.
And the Jewish would say, I'm not Palestini. And the Germans will say, I'm not French, I'm German, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about the countries which have formed in the 20th century are all formed on the basis of othering, right? So, earlier India othered people who believed that religion can be basis of a country, right? So, we are not Pakistanis because we do not believe in that and we are secular.
Yeah.
That has not changed to saying that we are Indians because we are Hindus. That's what the government's line is for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful line. It's a very powerful line because the main challenge of India has been caste. That there's a religion which sanctions certain people being pushed down to do certain things, menial jobs, right? I mean, that's a slavery in which you don't have to enforce it. It's just a social order of slavery, right? Worse than slavery in a lot of ways. I mean, there's no emancipation to this at all. You can't free yourself.
Yeah.
A slave could be free and become a free man.
Yeah.
In caste, there's nothing you can do for generations on, right?
Yeah.
And it's been on for the last 1500 years. So the only counter which has emerged to caste is saying that we are all Hindus. And by saying that we are all Hindus, you have to identify who is not a Hindu.
Yeah.
So you say CANRC and this and that, etc. So I mean, that's a reality.
So the last question, if you could change anything in India now, what would it be and why?
We'll change the state, you know. I mean, the people who are governing us are completely rabid people.
Yeah.
And they are making use of othering Muslims per se to create a whole dictatorship. I mean, there's a whole fascism. So, I mean, the fascism has to go. We have to become an extremely progressive, educated society which is driven by science and scientific thought, and what is historical as opposed to what's mythological. I mean, these are all, these are all indicators of fascism, and that's a big threat. And how do you undo fascism? There has been no easy answer to this historically.